The Magic Dads podcast is now available wherever you listen to podcasts or on YouTube at the Old Cranky Man Collectibles YouTube channel. Magic Dads is brought to you by Old Cranky Man Collectibles and all of our generous patrons over at patreon.com/MTG Dads Podcast. Go check it out for exclusive content and so much more. Magic Dads podcast.
How's it
sponsored
going?
By Old Cranky Man Collectibles. Head on over to the Old Cranky Man Collectibles YouTube channel and subscribe. Magic Dads is also now available wherever you listen to podcasts. Just go to your favorite podcast app like Spotify, type in MTG Dad Magic Podcast. So, how's it going? I'm your host, Blake. This is Stefan.
Slay?
It's been a long day.
Don't spill the beans. It's fine.
Bit of a rough start, but we're here.
Oh,
we're cranking it out.
We're gonna have some fun. Oh,
so we're gonna talk a lot about Canadian Highlander, right?
Oh, sure.
Yes. So if you haven't figured that out already, Stefan and I and our play group play a lot of Canadian Highlander.
Yeah. That's probably
real quick. I think most people that listen to this probably know what Canadian Highlander is, but just in case you don't, we're going to gloss over it real quick.
Yeah.
So Canadian Highlander is a 100-card singleton format, like Commander, but not. There's no Commander. There's no color identities. It's played 1v1, so 2 players, 20 life, and it uses the vintage ban list.
Yeah. So no racially insensitive cards or problematic cards, and no dexterity cards, no anti-cards, no silver bordered cards, as much as we'd love to play Ashnod's Coupon. The actual
No conspiracies.
Yeah. You also don't get the conspiracies or like the, any of the
draft-centric cards. Yep.
Yeah. But you do get to play really powerful stuff from the origins of Magic, as well as powerful stuff from now.
Yes.
And it all sort of falls into this list of cards that are about 30-ish cards that are worth points.
Correct.
And you can have 10 points in your deck. Up to
10 points.
Yeah.
Yep. So pointed cards are like Moxen, Mana Crypt, Ancestral Recall, Time Walk, Demonic Tutor, Birthing Pod, Crop Rotation. Generally, like some of the most powerful Magic cards are between 1 and 7 points.
For different reasons, but yeah.
Yes. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Actually, we're doing a series of videos, so we're going to talk about these 7-pointed cards specifically, and today we're going to talk about that card right there, Ancestral Recall.
Cards interesting. Sort of has it is very powerful, and it has its origins back in the beginning of Magic in Alpha Beta Unlimited. They did a run of what's called the Boon Cycle, which is every color got a single instant that gave you 3 of something for 1 mana of that. So we had Giant Growth at green, gives +3/+3 until end of turn. Dark Ritual gives you 3 black mana. The Healing Salve in white, it's really bad. It gains you 3 life or prevents 3 damage. Lightning Bolt is debatably the second best of them. 3 damage to any target for 1 red.
Yeah, I think Lightning Bolt is the second.
And then the most powerful with a bullet, and it's not closed by Country Mile, is Ancestral Recall, which is target player draws 3 cards for 1 blue mana, instant speed.
Recall says?
It says draw 3 cards or force your opponent to draw 3 cards. That's the original text on it. It is a modal spell, technically. If your opponent has no cards in the library, you can kill them with an Ancestral Recall. And recall is 7 points, and it probably deserves every one of them.
It most assuredly does deserve every point that is assigned.
It should never be lower. There's been some debate on whether or not it should be our first 8-point card. But we're kind of here to talk you out of it.
So I am here to tell you that you should stop putting Ancestral Recall in your blue tempo Canadian Highlander decks.
Yeah, really any blue deck that sort of looks at Ancestral Recall and goes, yeah, that's it. Easy answer.
Yes.
Yeah, and so let's kind of go into why recall is limited in its power based on the points that it has.
Yep.
Because at 7 points, it limits every other option you have
Yep.
in the number of in what cards you could put in, because all the other cards that are pointed, you can't run anything over 3.
Yes.
You can either pick 1 at 3, a 2 and a 1, or 3 1s.
Yep.
And that's it.
Yep. The typical moniker is recall +3 because
Yeah.
these decks, they don't care about the other 3 cards. It can just be whatever. This deck is built around Ancestral Recall, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
So I've spent a lot of time playing Ancestral Recall Tempo Blue decks, and almost every time, every game that I don't have an Ancestral Recall, I don't draw it or whatever, I feel like my deck sucks.
Right. Because you're utilizing a lot of 1-for-1 spell interaction. And the deck, a lot of these tempo decks, that's sort of the entirety of the axis of how they function.
Yep.
Is you're trading a spell for another spell.
Yep.
And then eventually you want to kind of outpace them in a way that you're going to win.
Yep, you get to a point where you just have way more resources than they do because you've been able to cast multiple spells in a turn, answer their threats, stick your own threat, and then you're able to like kind of hold up and protect that threat, or just continue to trade 1-for-1 and continue to get ahead that way. And eventually they run out of cards, and then you have your Ancestral Recall, which puts you way ahead. And that all sounds fine and great, but the problem is that right now in this specific metagame, there are so many cards that do an Ancestral Recall impression, and a lot of them do it better.
Or take recall out. We'll just stop recall from being an effective card.
Yeah. Here's my Force of Negation, and I will pitch a blue card, and now your Ancestral Recall is exiled. You can't regrowth it, you can't Snapcast or Mage it, you can't put it back on top of your deck with Mystic Sanctuary.
Yeah. Have you ever cast a Hole Breacher in response to a recall? There are ways to kind of functionally deal with this, and there's proactive ways too. Like there are Planeswalkers that limit the ability to draw cards, or Shieldred that punishes your opponent for drawing cards.
Yeah, it takes 6.
Yeah, exactly. and so there's a very real downside to running so many eggs into such a small basket.
Yeah.
Because while recall functionally represents 1% of the cards in your deck, it represents 70% of the points. Yeah. And it is also a card that doesn't, and this is debatable, obviously, but doesn't immediately win you the game.
No, it most certainly does not immediately win you the game.
No. Generally, the parlance is it's not the first recall that kills your opponent. It's the third. So these decks that are casting recall really want to cast them multiple times and are built to do that.
Yep.
But what happens when you don't draw your recall? When you don't draw your tutor to find your recall? Because again, you're limited on what kind of tutors you can run, because you can't run a demonic tutor. It's 4 points.
Yep.
And the other tutors that you're running are very face up. A mystical tutor that puts it on top of your library. Or if like you're probably not running Gifts Ungiven into it, but there's just, you could, but then that's very face up, and your opponent gets to select what you're getting. And if you're not immediately winning the game with a Gifts Ungiven, why are you spending your points on that card?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have a Gifts Ungiven in your deck, ladies and gentlemen, you have a Gifts Ungiven in your deck.
Right, that is a 1-card combo.
Yep, have a package of cards that you can get that will win you the game.
Yeah, and that's another thing is like there's so many pointed cards that you can play with a straight face that will end the game immediately if they resolve, or the turn after they resolve, like Gifts Ungiven, like Underworld Breach, and you never get the opportunity to play cards like that because you're always just recall +3.
Yeah.
And so like a lot of the times it's like Mana Drain, Treasure Cruise, True Name Nemesis, or some mixture of things like that. Like Treasure Cruise, I can totally get behind that. Treasure Cruise is a 1-pointed Ancestral Recall, absolutely, 100%.
That functionally does the same thing.
It does, yes.
Right? So that's 1 point. Obviously, a little contextual, but like the game plan for how those two are kind of are on the wind up on those is sort of the same. Like your wind up is to fill up your graveyard, and your punch through is to cast a spell and draw a bunch of new resources.
Yep. So like if you have recall in your deck and Treasure Cruise, you get 2 more points. You don't have the option to put like an Underworld Breach in your deck, for example. So if we take Ancestral Recall out of the equation, we are left with these other two cards that are, go in a deck that wants to put a whole bunch of cards into its graveyard. But now this also opens up the possibility that you can play a tutor to go find one of those cards, where you can't do that when you have Recall +3.
Or a tutor that could find another contextually powerful card.
Yeah.
So say if you had like a demonic tutor and your opponent has a card that you need to kill right now.
Yep.
Sometimes you just get a Swords to Plowshares to deal with that questing beast. And that's totally fine.
Or you win more games because you get to see specifically the card you want and not 3 random cards off at the top.
And then effectively, Demonic Tutor as a tutor functions as a second copy of the most powerful contextual card in your deck.
Yeah.
And so there are also cards that are 0 points that do a great impression.
There are so many cards that are 0 points that do Ancestral Recall things, but better.
Yeah.
First one, Expressive Iteration.
Yeah, cards, fantastic. It's been banned in multiple formats for a reason.
Yes, and
cards.
All of these recall decks that we're talking about, they're already playing Ancestral Recall. But the point that I'm trying to make is that you don't need Ancestral Recall to do Ancestral Recall things.
Yeah.
Stoneforge Mystic is another prime example of a card that does Ancestral Recall things.
Yeah.
You resolve Stoneforge Mystic and you go get a thing out of your, equipment out of your deck. If you get Cauldron Complete or a Batter Skull, you have just turned that Stoneforge Mystic into an Ancestral Recall.
Yep. Or sometimes it lets you stop your opponent from winning the game with like a Lion Sash.
Yeah.
Or it lets you draw a billion cards with a Skull Clamp.
Right. So, or pushes damage through and gains you life with a Shadow Spear.
Exactly. So there's, again, it's about that contextuality and the representation of a single card that can do more than just draw you 3 cards.
Yep.
Because sometimes drawing 3 cards is a limitation on its own because the resources are choked in your
I don't know how many times I've recalled and drawn 3 lands. A lot more than I would care to admit.
Exactly. Or you only have 3 lands in play and you play recall and you draw 1 and suddenly you're out of gas because 99% of the time you're casting a recall on your main phase so that you can do other things on your turn. You're not waiting. And then you leave yourself open for any kind of interaction, and they can exile it from your graveyard.
So Cameron was sitting next to me playing a game, and he drew his 7, and he looked at it, and it was land plus 6 cards. One of those cards was Ancestral Recall.
Yep.
And I said, you don't keep that.
No.
And he said, but land recall. And I was like, yeah, but your recall is, you want your recall to draw you lands. That's a bad recall.
Yeah.
Now, the recall would draw him out of the mulligan, but there's also the potential that he doesn't draw lands at all.
Yeah, I would say that it is more important to have a recall draw you out of a mulligan when you have an even amount of cards in your hand from both.
Yeah, so like if he was guaranteed his first and second land drops, I said 2 lands. Yeah, totally. You can keep that 1 land recall. You're hoping to draw at least 2 lands plus maybe 1 more card. But probably you just want 3 more lands to play the cards in your hand. Your Ancestral Recall looks pretty bad.
Turn 1 land and then you cast a recall, and either you brick on lands, which sucks, or you draw 3 cards, then you have to pitch some cards. And while you do sort of get to see the additional cards, that you've now exposed your recall to the graveyard, to the place where your opponent can interact with it negatively. And you've basically dumped 70% of your points in the first turn of the game in a place where it's not super impactful. So other cards that sort of do that impression,
anything that gives you initiative.
Right.
The initiative is absolutely insane. You put a creature into play, you get to go get a land immediately, and then you either get to scry or you get to put counters on it, and then eventually it domes your opponent for 5. And most of the creatures that have the initiative moniker attached to them are also absurd. Seasoned Dungeoneer, gets in there, puts a counter on it, mills a card, or puts a land into your hand, instantly gains protection from creatures. Like, these are cards, like, you play them, your opponent is going to want to immediately answer them, which automatically turns the land plus the card that they spend. That's your recall. That's the same card economy right there.
It's like if your opponent casts recall, you're kind of going, okay, let's see what happens. If your opponent casts one of the 3/4 initiative creatures
Yep.
that have additional value on
Mhm.
their body, everything clenches up.
Yes.
And that immediately the game has changed in a
Yep.
way that is bad for you.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
so, and then there's just cards like Dak Faden, where you're going to see additional cards every
Mhm.
turn in the same way that Recall would. You
Yeah,
get
a
to do
lot
a
of
lot.
planeswalkers do a
Yeah.
really good Ancestral Recall
Oh, agreed.
impression, and it's kind of similar to to the initiative thing where you put this creature, you put this planeswalker into play, and either it gives you more cards in hand or it answers
Mhm.
something on the board, and now your opponent has this thing that you have that they have to kill, and it just uses up their resources while giving you more resources.
Yeah, and it takes nothing, right? You just
No.
get that. You just get that over and over again.
Nope.
Whereas if your game plan is to cast Recall multiple times, there's other pieces that sort of have to fall into place.
Right.
Versus the Planeswalker is just a thing that does that.
Also,
every
if
turn.
your plan is to cast Recall more than one time via Snapcaster Mage or Regrowth or what have you,
Mhm.
there are other really good cards that you could also Regrowth back to your hand, like a Planeswalker or Initiative Creature or, the Demonic Tutor that you cast to go get your thing. Like,
Mhm.
those cards are still very, very good, even in the absence
Yeah.
of Recall.
Yeah, and Recall again, you're sort of at the mercy of the top of your deck.
Yeah.
Whereas DT, or sorry, for a demonic tutor, any powerful tutor is going to find you the exact right spell at that exact moment.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for cards that give you additional value, like a 3-for-1 with Ancestral Recall, I think people are underplaying board wipes.
Yes, yep, that's absolutely 100%. You cast a Supreme Verdict or a Wrath of God or something like that, you get to destroy 2, 3, sometimes more of your opponent's creatures. Again,
Oh,
there's
yeah.
your card economy right there, and not only that, but now your opponent has to they have to rebuild from that.
Yeah. And they've probably overcommitted to the board at this point. And I cannot tell you the amount of times that if you're empty-handed and your opponent has creatures on board that will kill you next turn, you don't want to draw the Recall. You want to draw the Wrath of God. Because the Recall is, again, you're at the mercy of that top deck, versus if you draw the Wrath, that's the Wrath. That's the one card.
Yep.
And you can build your deck in a way where that Recall can be, or not that Recall, the Wrath can be tutorable either by a demonic tutor, or like if you put a dam in your deck, you can put in Spellseeker.
That's the next one. That's the big one. So Spellseeker, 3 points.
3-point
right?
card.
Okay, but you can turn a Spellseeker, a 3-pointed card, into an Ancestral Recall plus a card.
Yeah, even
So
better.
you Spellseeker, go get Ephemerate. Ephemerate your Spellseeker, go get something else. In your next upkeep, now you can Ephemerate the Spellseeker again, and now you have drawn 3 cards, plus you have a 2/2 in play.
Yeah, or you can set up loops where you're getting back this Ephemerate every turn and getting a new spell every turn. And it's like that value engine. And I think a lot of people hear about this and they immediately think the Time Lock deck, the combo deck.
You don't need it. Great. So a lot of these kind of blue mid-rangey tempo-y decks, they can get really good use out of Ephemerate. They're playing the initiative creatures.
Yep.
They're playing the evoke elementals.
Yeah.
In some cases they're playing Omnath, Locust of Creation. And Ephemerate looks really, really good in those decks.
Yeah, especially if you're like 1-for-1, 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 and then you deploy a creature that gives you some amount of value, then that Ephemerate is going to get more valuable every time that you cast it and you can get it back. I would rather regrow an Ephemerate most of the time than an Ancestral Recall, just because your board-based advantage is going to be so much better. So as far as like spells that do a reasonable impression, I do want to talk about Factor Fiction.
Okay. Yep.
Because, when you talk about Factor Fiction, it is, all right, admittedly more expensive. It's 4 mana, but you actually see more cards.
Yeah. Yep.
And it is a
you get to choose which ones you put into your hand.
Your opponent gets to choose in some small way.
No,
but at the same time,
they get to separate them in 2 piles. You get to pick what goes into your hand.
If they're a good player, you're going to have a slightly more arduous decision, but the decision is sort of made immediately based on the context of the game.
Right.
If they're a bad player, you just won the game.
on that.
No,
Though.
but I'm just saying in any case where Ancestral Recall doesn't allow your opponent to misplay. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
no, I do. I
factor
know
fiction,
exactly what you
they
mean.
can
I
misplay and
resolved
you
a
still might
few.
be winning.
I resolved a few factor fictions today.
Yeah. So that's the concept, is that there is a possibility for a much higher ceiling on factor fiction than there is on recall.
Yeah.
Because you're seeing
Absolutely.
more cards and you're just gonna let your opponent misplay if they want to.
Yeah,
If they
absolutely.
don't know your deck. And when I say misplay, I don't necessarily mean that they're bad. I mean that may not know what's in your hand. They don't know what your plan
Right.
is, and they don't know what you want. If that is information that is hidden from them, they might set up the piles in a way where they cannot win from that position.
Cool. Cryptic Command, also a 4-mana blue instant that does a really good Ancestral Recall impression.
Sort of like another card that does different things based on the context of the game.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a late game card, right? But if you've gotten there and if you're looking to win the game, sometimes you just need a way to stop your opponent from winning.
Yeah.
Or, like, sometimes it just taps them down and you get to swing in with it.
So unlike Ancestral Recall, Cryptic Command does actually combo with Mystic Sanctuary.
Oh, yeah.
And you can recast it every turn until you eventually win the game.
Yeah. It's such a powerful loop. And it does cost some amount of mana, but when they don't get to attack you, it's sort of a level of inevitability.
So that's the reason, I think, why Ancestral Recall is just so powerful, because it's 1 mana, draw 3 cards. Right? We can never let this card be less than 7 points.
No.
And I could probably be talked into making it possibly more.
Yeah.
But at one mana, the card is absurdly broken. And if you look at a card like Tidings has the same text as Ancestral Recall, but it costs 5 mana. It's unplayable.
No. Yeah. It is a contextual, like, as one of the most powerful cards in the game, it also has the lowest floor almost, right? Versus ceiling, because again, you don't know what you're going to draw generally. I mean, obviously there's ways to set it up, but if your setup is to make Ancestral Recall better, try a different setup.
You want to know what my favorite deck to put Ancestral Recall is?
Oh yeah, go on.
Mono red.
Red deck Recall. But that's, again, like, that is correct, because when the top of your deck is most likely a lightning bolt.
Yeah. That other card that we mentioned at the beginning,
Drawing 3 lightning bolts for 0 points each, much better than drawing, anything else generally. I've killed way more people with lightning bolts than I have Ancestral Recalls.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Most definitely. Okay, cool. Well, that's why you should be playing something other than Ancestral Recall.
Yeah, play
in
something
your
else.
blue tempo decks. Try it out, though. For real, try it out. I think you'd be surprised.
Try
pick up a Spell Seeker, get an Ephemerate in your deck, and go hog wild.
Yeah.
And then you get 4 more points to play around with.
Yeah, put a Demonic Tutor in there. Splash black. Live a little. Try Grixis. I want to thank everybody for listening to this. I know we rambled a bit about points, but we're going to come back to you and talk about more 7-pointed cards as we go on.
Yeah, which one should we do next?
I think maybe it's Black Lotus.
We should do Black Lotus next?
I think so. Like, from a power perspective.
So next week we'll talk about Black Lotus.
Yeah, good card. Debatable.
Thanks for listening to Magic Dads, and as always, we want to remind you that we're proud of you.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.